Greetings and welcome to Navigating the Language of the Sea. My name is Robin Gullickson, and this is History of the English Language with Dr. Catherine Shreves. For some of us, the language of the sea, known more formally as Maritime English or Ship English, was first introduced to us in the form of this comical, curmudgeonly cartoon character known as Popeye the Sailor Man. More recently, it's the infamous Jack Sparrow that attempts to capture the essence of life on the high seas in the 18th century. For more than a century, from Billy Budd to Queequeg, from Captain Ahab to Horatio Hornblower, great authors and eventually Hollywood directors have tried to create realistic representations of these fascinating sailor characters. While both historical and modern depictions of sailors' life are fascinating and romantic, it is the portrayal of the language and jargon, spoken almost universally, which distinguishes the seaman from every other linguistic community, and authentic or not, captures the true essence of the character. No one would consider them realistic if they spoke the Queen's English after all. Not only has English been dominant as the language of the sea, Maritime English, in turn, has had an enduring effect on the lexical and idiomatic nature of English throughout the ages. Whether nautical in origin or adopted by sailors for the use in their own special domain, there are hundreds of words, metaphors, and idioms that are familiar to us, some more recognizable and more memorable than others, and all with a colorful maritime history that has withstood the test of time. You are about to embark on a historical, lexical, and idiomatic voyage, from the earliest beginnings of Maritime English to the modern institutional changes that have established English as the lingua franca of the sea. Historically speaking, during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, there were significant increases in exploration, colonization, trade, and slavery, and along with many battles and wars to maintain the lead in all of them. None of these enterprises could take place without a strong presence on the seas, and the English and the Dutch were the leaders. Britain's sailors were always at the forefront of expansion, whether waging almost incessant wars, both in trade and armed conflict with their European neighbors, or discovering and exploiting new trade routes and protecting imperial possessions. There was not an ocean where Britain did not have, at one time or another, mariners collecting and disseminating, along with everything else, their language. So let's take a look at the timeline regarding the kind of evolution of English as the main language spoken on board ships. So during the 16th and 17th centuries, the trading superiority of the Dutch East India Company meant that the majority of sailors were Dutch, and then therefore it was Dutch that was the primary language spoken on board. Competition between the English and Dutch in the 17th and 18th centuries led to 4 naval wars and eventually weakened the Dutch trading superiority. By the end of the 18th century, the Dutch no longer held supremacy. The number of foreign sailors on Dutch ships increased to roughly 50% from 25%, and a new lingua franca was needed for communication among the international crews and with other ships and other ports. At the beginning of the 19th century, The rise of the British Empire, both on sea and on land, meant that the English language began to conquer the maritime world. The Industrial Revolution and British expansion during this time led to a huge increase in international trade, and consequently, the lexicon exploded. The ports and dockyards were central to maintaining and supporting Britain's growing superiority, affecting virtually every part of the British Isles. And you can see from the map that there were just the entire south coast of Britain was all shipping ports. So these communities were both isolated and self-sufficient. Every craft and expertise needed for shipbuilding and for trade, sails, rigs, barrels, more things, guns, belonged to the Navy. The specialized language and terminology that was associated with all of these different activities and skills and crafts was often born and flourished in these isolated communities. This isolation did have an effect on the language. Life at sea was arduous, dangerous, and unsanitary. Crews were little better than slave labor. Sailors were often away from home and family for years at a time. The loss of manpower through battle, disease, or desertion was rampant, forcing the Navy and trading companies to staff their ships with men from any available source, creating crews with international backgrounds. Many of these crew members were oppressed men or convicts who were restricted from shore leave, often for fear that they might desert. The isolation from other communities had an impact on the sailors' language. They developed a distinctive style of speech and a highly specialized lexicon based on their work and their exposure to strange and exotic places. So while it was the isolation that fostered the growth of ship English, the language did not stay isolated within the maritime community. According to Isolus, communities that develop a specific language aspect will spread their influence on the language development of the societies they come into contact with. The sheer size and importance of the naval and merchant marine communities ensured that their highly specialized terms and expressions would likely be spread as far as their ships could take them. The language also spread beyond the ports and seafaring towns. Men that survived the extreme conditions at sea but were no longer physically able to perform their duties would retire and return to lives outside of the isolated port towns and seafaring communities. So their specialized language would eventually make it into the language of the general population. So this spreading of the language does have some global implications. There have been numerous studies exploring the influence of maritime or ship English on a more global scale. One study has concluded that there is strong evidence that the presence of nautical terms and speech in many Creoles suggests that ship English and not standard English is the major component in the superstrate that influenced them all. So according to this study, according to Bailey and Ross, the Creoles that developed in seaside communities that were common ports of call for many of the vessels transporting slaves and cargo were the result of sailors not only influencing the language, but of actually being instrumental in founding and maintaining the colonies themselves. They suggest that because English sailors eventually settled in these communities, including along the west coast of Africa, marrying local women and continuing to trade in goods and slavery, they developed a Guinea Coast Creole English, which may have found its way to the Caribbean along with the slaves. One thing that was true or a couple things that are true, is there's a strong presence of nautical terms and speech in many of the Creoles, and neither the educated and scholarly nor the wealthy and noble were the people hanging around the docks conversing and bargaining and trading with the locals. So the steam engine had another important effect upon the English language, the maritime English language. Up until the invention of the steam engine, sailors were generally uneducated and untrained, learning both their language and their craft on the job. The Industrial Revolution and the technological advances of the steam engine meant that sailors or mariners would need different and more specialized skills to operate these ships. So not only did they have to acquire new skills, there had to be effective ways of training the crew and a level of communication that would facilitate competent running of these new ships. Naval colleges were established, and the training manuals and rules and regulations were all written in English, often by sea captains and other Navy members. A major effect was the new prestige that came with having a genuine profession with proper education and working conditions and salaries. The international crews had to learn English in order to become professionals and to perform their duties. So the steam engine had a big effect. So let's look at the documentation of the language. Throughout the 18th century, the initial education that seamen received was technical, navigation, sailing, and ship maintenance. So there were technical manuals. But as the language spread and more people, including the general population, were exposed to this unique sailor's language, began to be written down and printed. And in the 19th century, maritime manuals and dictionaries, which were used on board, were also made it into the general population. Also, after the War of 1812, especially in America, there was an increase in demand for naval stories in popular literature, in a new genre, the maritime narrative, which popularized the common sailor, was born. So tracing the spoken language is difficult. There are few written documentations of sailors' language that can provide reliable examples of spoken ship English. According to Bailey and Ross, they were either not recorded or recorded sporadically. Although most sailors and some captains were illiterate, there was a duty to keep and submit logs and records to the British naval offices. As such, there are written records, mostly from 1660 and beyond, which provide some evidence about the speech on board ships. Bailey and Ross have concluded, however, that these are not the most reliable sources because of the difficulty in determining speech characteristics based on written text. They also inferred that the texts were likely written by the better educated among the crew, and may not have reflected the speech of the common sailor. They were also concerned that the language in the documents was primarily naval jargon and could have different characteristics than other vessels like slave ships or merchant ships. And finally, most of what was written in the logs was limited to details necessary for reporting weather and sea conditions, location, route, longitude and latitude coordinates, and the occasional altercation with other ships. So not the most reliable documentation of just the general linguistic or language speech of the average seaman. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at the lexicon. Many of the words that are used in our modern vocabulary have their origins at sea, either introduced as new words or as new meanings given to words commandeered by sailors to identify specific areas of ships or events at sea or sailing maneuvers. Sailors adapted their language from what was familiar to them at home, often assigning new meanings to everyday words like buttocks and bosom. Some of the oldest nautical terms date back to the early Old English and Old English periods, and those are actually the most familiar, and their meanings have never changed. Some terms, like the nautical prepositions listed here, were actually coined by the maritime community in the interest of saving time and communicating commands more efficiently. So here are just some general facts and figures provided by the Oxford English Dictionary online. Some historical and statistical facts about the lexical history. One thing, the OED categorizes nautical terms under the larger heading of transport, so it was a little difficult to find them at first. Under this heading, more than 70% of the listings in this category of transport are nautical in origin. With some 6,365 entries, nautical terms and usages comprise the fourth largest category in the OED. Only the sciences, and not even all of the sciences, religion, and, believe it or not, the performing arts have more entries. Literature, with 6,155 entries, was a close fifth. So the first citations for the bulk of nautical terms or nautical uses of non-nautical terms is between 1600 and 1900, and then the timeline chart shows the enormous increase of in the lexicon from the last half of the 16th century through the 19th century. So we'll look at a few nautical terms, not too many. This isn't going to be a dictionary. So Isserlis categorizes the terms as either transparent for words and expressions that have obvious correlation to their maritime origins, or opaque, words and expressions for which the nautical relationship is more obscured. So there are three samples of just opaque nautical terms from the OED. Didn't seem necessary to have samples of transparent nautical terms. So I just chose these three because they were interesting to me. I had no idea that they had nautical origins. One being rummage, which is the arranging or rearranging of cargo, which actually does sort of make sense if I think about a rummage sale. It must have something to do with cargo. A skyscraper was originally a triangular sky sail until someone decided that a building would also be called a skyscraper. And jerry-built or jury-rig is just an expression I've always been curious about where that came from, and it's actually nautical in origin as a temporary mast to replace one that's broken. Now it just means anything that replaces something that's broken. So that's just a few quick look at some nautical terms to give you an idea. So perhaps the most distinctive legacy of maritime English history, more than the lexicon, ancient and modern, more than the technological terms that exploded in the blink of an historical eye, even more than the various creoles developed around the world, It is the overwhelming number of phrases, metaphors, and idioms that are truly a part of our everyday speech. Many, like to chart a safe course or to give some latitude, are quite transparent in their association with the sea. There are, however, quite a lot that are in the opaque category. We use them constantly, completely unaware of their nautical origins. The list is far too long for a mere PowerPoint presentation, obviously, so I will list and explain a few of my favorites, and then I have provided a very long list at the end of the presentation in Appendix A, and you can, peruse through those and ask me for the meanings of any of them that strike your fancy, and I'd be happy to provide it. So I chose halcyon days because this is my particular favorite. I so love knowing the meaning, the origin of this expression. The halcyon, or kingfisher, was a seabird that in ancient times was fabled or believed to lay its eggs in seaweed at a certain time during December, when the seas were particularly calm, and mariners would look forward to these halcyon days, knowing that the seas and the weather would be calm. Then there's three sheets in the wind, or as we're probably more familiar with it, three sheets to the wind, which means to be extremely drunk. And according to Jeans, to have one sheet in the wind means just to be moderately drunk. The sheet is the line or rope that attaches to a sail, and if it lets go and flaps in the wind, the sheet and the boat are both out of control. So we can see the connection there. By and large is based entirely on sailing terms, which by and large means generally speaking. When a ship is sailing into the wind, she's close hauled, but if she's a little off the wind, the sail is by or near it. And sailing large is another term meaning the wind is not quite over the stern. So, interestingly, Jeans points out that these two terms are mutually exclusive. You actually can't sail by and large at the same time. But the saying has certainly stuck. And finally, to show one's true colors refers to the colors or flags flown by ships to identify themselves as in their country of origin, and also sometimes used to send messages. So during battles at sea, it was not unusual for some ships to fly false colors as a way of hiding their nationality. So where are we in terms of modern maritime English? Nadia Demidenko points out that in the maritime world, communicating efficiently using the English language is becoming an increasingly paramount factor for carrying out safe and efficient operations. And there are many new challenges. From naval vessels to Coast Guard ships, cruise ships to cargo ships, fishing boats to pleasure craft, there is an enormous amount of traffic on the seas today. And there are no stop signs and no stoplights. There are shipping lanes, but they're not exclusive, and it only means that if you happen to be in one, you better be on the lookout for a big ship, because you will see them before they will see you. Also, the prevalence of international ships with international crews created a need for a language that could be understood across all dialects and accents. Not only do the crews need to speak and understand English, they also need to speak a language that leaves no question as to their intent. So ships did at one time communicate by means of their colors or flags, as we mentioned previously. As technology improved and radio communication became the new medium, and as traffic on the high seas increased, the use of English as the lingua franca encountered new challenges. Miscommunication through VHF radio has been shown to be directly responsible for or has contributed to many shipping accidents. In 1973, the International Maritime Organization, the IMO, mandated that English was to be the language for all maritime matters. And then in 1982, a British linguist, Edward Johnson, joined the IMO to help set the standard, which came to be known as Seaspeak, and this became the official language, the official maritime language in 1988. Then in 1995, the IMO recommended a modified version of Seaspeak, known as Standard Marine Communication Phrases, or SMCP, which is a set of procedures for initiating, maintaining, and terminating radio communication, and includes recommendations for vocabulary, grammar, and sentence structure. So here's a closer look at Seaspeak, or SMCP. There are two main patterns of radio communication that are specified: special purpose messages and routine messages. Special purpose messages are distress, urgency, and safety, and they have their own message markers: Mayday, Pan-Pan, and Securite. Routine messages, instruction, advice, warning, information, question, answer, request, and intention, also have themselves basically as message markers. The use of message markers minimizes assumptions and reduces the level of unexpectedness by the hearer. They also help to eliminate misunderstandings that may arise from wrongful interpretation. So just going to take a closer look at some of the grammatical choices and samples for SMCP. These are taken from the IMO's Standard Marine Navigational Vocabulary and Standard Marine Communication Phrases. There are, I think, over 20 of them, so this is just a small sampling of, but they're interesting. The avoidance of synonyms. So you would always use the word vessel instead of ship. So everybody uses the same word. The avoidance of contracted forms. Always say cannot instead of can't. There's a preference for Latinisms over other words. Continue instead of go on. Require instead of need. Assistance instead of help. They use fully worded answers to yes or no questions. So, is the boat leaking? Yes, the boat is leaking. They use fully worded responses to all routine messages. Should we bail her out? Yes, you should bail her out. Numbers are spoken digit by digit, so 295 is 295. And letters are always spelled out using the NATO phonetic alphabet. We're all familiar with the Alpha Bravo Charlie. I've just included a quick little chart here that tells you all of the letters from Alpha to Zulu. So here we are at our journey's end. As you have seen, the language of the sea has a long, colorful, and complex history. It's global in its scope, and it is still undergoing change. Curiously, in the context of standard versus non-standard Englishes, maritime English seems to be moving in the opposite direction of other spoken Englishes. Not only is there a recommended vocabulary, there are very narrow and specific guidelines for how to speak and how to respond. No language could be more prescribed, and no one would argue that it is in the best interests of the entire seagoing community to maintain this standard. I hope you enjoyed the voyage, and please feel free to ask me any questions. Thank you very much for listening.